I'm Harriette Van Spall, cardiologist and clinical trialist from McMaster University in Canada, and I am absolutely honored to have one of my favorite people in medical publishing and in research here with me, Professor Joseph Hill, Professor of Medicine from UT Southwestern and Editor-in-Chief of Circulation, where we know each other from. And we are here to just chat about your career path and how you have navigated the various obstacles, challenges, and growth opportunities as a clinician researcher to the point of leading this fabulous journal. And so I never gave you an agenda for our discussion. I just invited you. You were gracious enough to accept. And so tell us, how your career started and what some of the choices were at the initial phase of career development.
Well, Harriette, I'm honored and flattered that you would ask me to do this. And we've been friends for a long time. And, I decided in college that I wanted to do research. And I almost did a PhD in physical chemistry, but I decided, I wanted to do something that has more direct impact on human beings. So I ended up doing an MD PhD at Duke. And I chose cardiology because for two reasons. Number one, I did find, and I still find it intellectually appealing to walk into a room, speak with someone, listen to do the physical exam, and walk out of the room at least with a provisional idea of what's going on. Mm-hmm. Some specialties in medicine, as you know well, rely exclusively on the piece of paper that used to be a piece of paper with lab numbers and so forth, which is fine, but I enjoy the personal part. I did and I still do. And I also was attracted to the fact that the science in cardiology is very, very closely aligned with the clinical aspects. In my view, as I've told early career people many times, if you think you're smart enough to be a doctor and to be a funded and published investigator, you should put those worlds close together. And so that's where I ended up in cardiology.
Okay, so you finished your cardiology fellowship, and then when did you fit in the PhD? Was that a concomitant journey for you, or did you do it in a stepwise approach?
Yeah, most schools in the U.S., when you do an MD PhD, you do a couple of years of medical school, then you Z out and do the PhD, and then you come back and finish medical school, which is what I did. Now, a little bit of an anecdote here. When I'd married my wife Beverly at that time, and I was all ready to start thinking about an internship, and she announced that she wanted to go do a PhD at the Sorbonne in Paris.
Okay.
And I was, what? And she talked me into it, and the agreement was between us that we would stay a couple of years, and because I need to come back and do my clinical training.
Right.
But in reality, we stayed for 5 years. It changed our lives, changed both of our lives, to live in another culture, see your homeland through the eyes of other people, travel, learn a new language, all those things. And that's not the first time when she has been right.
I didn't know that was the context that led you to Paris. So how did you navigate the language barrier? Did you learn French?
I did. Even after 5 years, at the lab I was in was full of lovely, wonderful people who speak, good English. And so they walked me through it. I went to the Alliance Française a few times. And but after a year, I was, I could certainly speak scientific French, and hold my own to some extent in a dinner party. And yeah, so after about a year, I was, reasonably comfortable.
There's something to be said for leaving your country and going elsewhere, as you mentioned, and looking at your country through a different lens. What were some of the insights you gained during that time?
I've thought a lot about that. There are many things that in the French culture that are superior to my culture. Mm-hmm. There are some things that we do better, and I think all cultures can learn from each other. One of the things that I admire about France, and there are many, is a meal is a phenomenon in your day. You're not reading a paper or doing email during a meal, and whereas I do, and I still do, but I admire that. We stayed in the home of a family of friends in Lyon one time, and I marveled that the 16-year-old son and dad spent 20 minutes debating whether the oranges today are better than yesterday. And they thought about it, and I was intrigued by that as one anecdote.
Right. I do think more North Americans, more of us, ought to travel in our formative years to better understand the world and the people we serve, even in our own countries. So you said you extended your period of time in Paris?
For 5 years. It was postdoctoral fellowship one after the other for me.
Right.
Bev, my wife, was doing a PhD, so she wasn't able to procure funding, but I was just writing postdoc grants all the time, and we managed to eke it along for 5 years.
Right, and then you returned to the U.S., and what made you decide to come back home?
We were planning to come back home.
Okay.
I mean, as much as I loved France, I felt like a visitor. I was a visitor. I wasn't a native. Certainly my French was not fluent at that level. But we came back and moved to Boston, and I trained at the Brigham and had a fabulous experience there, and had our first son, Christopher, was born at the Brigham.
And then how did you end up at UT Southwestern? Tell us a little bit about the decision making along the way.
Well, when I finished my training in medicine and cardiology, I was prepared to move anywhere in the country. And I sent out letters all around and got a number of, thanks but no thanks. A few people did not respond, but a few did. And a person named Don Heisted called me on the phone and said, "Joe, why don't you come out to the University of Iowa and see what we're doing here?" So I had to pull out a map and see where Iowa was. Flew out there, and this is a true story. That night I had a dinner with him, the chief of cardiology, and 2 Howard Hughes investigators. And Don said, "Joe, what are you looking for?" And I said, "I'm looking for a place that is as invested in me as I am in myself, because I have to be successful. I have to make this work. I don't know the rules. I don't know when I'm supposed to get an R01. I don't know what tenure means, how much clinical, I don't know what the rules are." And Don laughed. And I thought, okay, I guess I really messed up there. And then he said, "I bet you're wondering why I laughed?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Because, Joe, that's a Harvard question. At Iowa, that question makes no sense to us. Of course, we will do that." And I thought, okay, I'm in. I have to check with the wife, but I'm in.
Okay, so you moved to Iowa, and what were some of the challenges you navigated at that stage in your career?
Well, Iowa was and is a great place, and lovely, lovely people. I was the classic 20% clinical, 80% research. And, I told myself, my back is against the wall. This has to work. And so I was in my office writing grants till midnight on a regular basis, whatever it took. About 18 months into it, Don asked me to take on the role of program director for the fellowship. And I thought, whoa, this is too early for me. But I decided to do it, and I loved it. And after having been there for about 4.5 years, I got a call from UT Southwestern about the chief of cardiology job there. And a very similar institution to Iowa, substantially larger. And the research interests that are strong there align very much with my own, the myocyte biology. So I picked up with the family. At that point, we'd had a second son who was born in Iowa, and we moved to Dallas.
Right, and there's a striking amount of mistrust related to some of the politics of COVID-19. There's been a lot of dialogue online with disinformation and mistrust of science and scientific investigation. There's been a change in funding of scientists. There's almost this cultural shift towards regarding science as something that's unnecessary, that there are overinvestments in, that scientists are privileged and perhaps don't deserve some of the funding. So tell us about some of the challenges that you faced as a scientist to sort of put this discussion, to give some context to this discussion, to correct some of the misperceptions about scientific work and the amount that we invest in answering hypothesis-driven questions or exploring important mechanistic questions.
Well, I've thought a lot about that. In fact, I wrote an article about medical misinformation a few years ago that frankly went viral. But what I tell patients is some of the medicines we give you, like a statin, sure, there are side effects, and you can look online and find all kinds of exaggerations, but the benefit is invisible. You made it another year without a heart attack. The benefit, you don't see the benefit, all you see is the potential downside. The other thing that puzzles me and you and others is nobody doubts the science inside your cell phone. When you get on an airplane, you don't doubt aeronautical science. When you cross a bridge, you trust, mechanical engineering. So somehow it's uniquely biological and medical science that has engendered this skepticism, which I find puzzling. I do think that we've done a bad job of teaching the scientific method, in our schools, that science ultimately self-corrects, and that doesn't mean someone was wrong. It's just that the data as they have emerged have led to the truth. And
I also think that our scientific training doesn't emphasize the importance of communication, and this cuts across some of what you do as the editor-in-chief at Circulation. We are taught to write, but we're often not taught the importance of reaching people where they are, and the broad range of people who are knowledge users. So as an editor, how do you extend the reach of some of the scientific work that is such high quality? I mean, I'm so impressed by the rigor with which manuscripts are peer-reviewed at Circulation, and the editors meet, and there's debate and discussion every week. There's so much love poured into the scientific process and the quality of reporting. But I often feel that manuscripts aren't read even by clinicians and researchers. So what do you think we need to do to reach all the people that need that high quality science disseminated to them?
well, that's a wonderful question, Harry. I wish I had a simple answer. You're right. We hold ourselves at Circulation, as is true at most journals, to a very, very high standard. And we are the gatekeepers of cardiovascular truth, and that's something that we and I feel honored and a privilege that we cherish. That said, nowadays, many people now live in an echo chamber where they hear whatever the source of information that they rely on. And for many people, that's social media. Of course, we do a lot of social media, but we don't touch the people who are not highly educated in the world of biology and medicine. And as you may know, there's this individual named Joe Rogan who was interviewing Elon Musk the other day and said that the Biden administration spent $250 million on transgender mice.
I'm sorry to chuckle. Yes, it highlights the role that ignorance plays in some of the disinformation, and some of it may be willful. But finish your thought.
Well, again, there's literature around this topic that I don't participate in, but I've read that nowadays people seek out the information that aligns with what they want to hear.
Right.
And I read something about back under Richard Nixon, when Richard Nixon apparently hated Cronkite and the CBS News, but yet the truth, the drumbeat of truth, ultimately led to Nixon's resignation.
Right.
But now we're in a different place. There are people who want to hear, whatever their channel of information is, and they only listen to that.
Right, and that disinformation came from somebody higher up in the administration, but they really they weren't referring to transgender mice. It was transgenic mice.
That was what it was, transgenic, right?
Right, and so we shouldn't lose that point on the audience members, because some people may not have heard of this anecdote, but it goes to show how something that's, completely different may be conflated to sort of sell a political point to win favor in audience members, and we shift the truth. And then for knowledge users, it's hard to discern what that truth was, because it's evolved with each iteration of the story. I have to say, I know you and I know Bev, and you were truly so accomplished, but also so humble. And you have a way of leading that is so unique. You lead by example. You are a doer. You are responsive. You are incredibly compassionate. Where did some of those traits come from? I often wonder about life journeys that make people a certain way. Did you endure any experiences that have shaped the kind of leader you are? What would you say those were?
Well, you flatter me again. I've been very privileged. I've had, I grew up in a middle class family with lovely parents, and who actually, they were peasants. They were during their depression. My mother grew up in a house with no electricity and no heat, and they made themselves middle class. My father was a businessman, and somehow in my head I said, I need to take this to the next level. That's my responsibility. And for me, doing that was to be a physician in academia, and that's in my. No one ever asked me to do that, but that's what I decided was my responsibility. And again, I've been privileged, a lovely wife. We've been married 43 years, and together we both, that's how we are wired. We don't buy a bunch of cars or, a second home. We would rather, use our resources and our energy to help others. And that, again, I feel like I'm saying too much about that, but it is how my wife and I are programmed.
And it comes across in such tangible ways. I just had to ask where that soul comes from. What would you say your greatest challenges have been as a leader in your cardiology division? You've certainly moved your body of research forward as a scientist, and you have taken circulation to a new level as editor-in-chief. What have been some of the main challenges in those roles, and what are some lessons you can leave the rest of us as learning points so that we can grow? If there's any advice I gave my sons, and that would be to follow your passions. Whatever you're passionate about, you should do that. Mm-hmm. And I am passionate about medicine and science. And I don't know where that came from, but it is enduring. And, a challenge, I was chief of cardiology for 21 years. Mm-hmm. And medicine changed a lot during that period of time. Mm-hmm. The corporatization of medicine, the decision-making that's moved up into the C-suite and so forth has changed the role of you and I as leaders in academic cardiology. And I understand much of that. Fortunately, both of us are at an institution where the academic flame shall never be snuffed out, but it has been snuffed out at some places. And I find that very sad. But again, I've lived on a daily basis these changes that occur as things move up into the business
conversation in academic medicine.
Right. And then what about challenges at circulation? Where do you think some of the growth opportunities are in medical publishing?
Good question. My strongly held view is that we need to reach out to our readers, whoever they are. Some of them are investigators who write papers and may cite a paper. Others are clinicians purely who never write papers. And so we need to make sure we speak to both. So citations is not our major driver by a long shot. We have to speak to both of those stakeholders. We have to provide the information in the manner in which they want to hear it. Millennials nowadays, they enjoy podcasts or streaming mechanisms. I'm a dinosaur who still likes to hold a paper journal in my hands, and and the website and so forth. So that's constantly evolving, and there's been a huge proliferation of new journals, including some predatory journals, as you're aware. So things are changing, always changing, but it's an incredibly exciting opportunity, to be charged with being a gatekeeper of verifiable, reproducible truth in cardiovascular science.
And how have you found working with the industry, with publishing companies that are profit generating? They rest a lot of their own productivity on the shoulders of physician scientists who seem to be a dying breed. So how does that tension play out as editor-in-chief?
I'm fortunate to work with both the AHA and with our publisher, Wolters Kluwer, and I'm 9 years into this, and never once has either one of them asked me to tip the scale one way or the other. Never, not a single time. And at this point, we probably handle 60,000 papers, and that has never once happened. I know that's not true universally. Many journals are profit-making enterprises, and so my belief is that their priorities are different. Something that will make a splash on the front page of the New York Times is something that I think some journals target, whereas we don't. So I'm fortunate that the society that ultimately owns the circulation family of journals, the AHA, and our publisher have been respectful and cooperative and let us do what we do best.
Right. So I'm going to end with something that's a sad point for me, that the editorial board will change and you'll be passing on the baton to somebody else. What do you think are desirable traits, characteristics, skill sets for the next editor-in-chief who takes over this fabulous flagship journal that I've grown to love so much?
Well, I feel strongly that the journal circulation should maintain its balance of clinical papers and basic papers. It's been that way for 50 years. For us, it's about 2 or 3 clinical papers for 1 basic paper, more or less, 2 to 1, maybe 3 to 1. You need an editor-in-chief who speaks both languages. You can't have 2 editors. You can't have a basic editor and a clinical editor, because then you have 2 journals. So the person who's ultimately responsible has to be a practicing cardiologist who does research in one area and has good taste in the other. Now, I believe that many clinical investigators are not really facile in fundamental molecular biology.
Sure.
So a physician scientist like me and many others who does basic science, but who also has taste and perspective in the clinical research area would be my idea.
What's your next big thing, Professor Hill?
I've thought a lot about life after circulation, and I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you I am keen and energized to do something next, for sure. I will still be a physician. I will still be run a reasonably large lab, but I'm ready to take on a new challenge, and I don't know what that is just yet.
Okay. Well, on that note, I will thank you for joining me to discuss your career and lessons learned and your journey as a clinician, scientist, and chief editor of Circulation. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much. I'm honored that you would ask me to do this.